Welcome to the final lecture on the theory of modeling. We'll have one more lecture where I introduce an exercise, and now we're in this lecture. I'll talk about mathematical modeling of the cardiovascular system. We talked about conceptual modeling of the cardiorespiratory system, so a bit more general, and now we'll focus on mathematical modeling. There's a number of types of mathematical models. I've mentioned ordinary differential equations, and we usually tackle those via an analytical solution. You've heard about the impulse response and convolution. You've heard about the transfer function, where you can simply use a multiplication, but then you need to transfer back and forth, for example, Laplace or Fourier transforms. And these techniques work best for the analysis of linear time invariant single input, single output systems. And they work best for specific inputs, for example, a step or an impulse or a ramp. But what we want to do is we want to simulate physiological systems, and many physiological systems are nonlinear, some are time variant, almost all of them are multiple input, multiple output. And we want to simulate them for all kinds of funny inputs. So for that, we need another technique. And state variables offer that. They allow us to work with nonlinear time variant memo systems and can easily be numerically integrated for all different inputs. So what is a state variable model? And this is again hopefully a reminder, but I'll take the Jeffrey et al. Example. The relationship between rate of oxytocin and infusion and concentration in the blood can be written by this ordinary differential equation. Now in the Jeffrey paper, the authors separate that into two equations. One is a state equation for the mass, drug mass, oxytocin mass, as a function of rate, and there's a parameter P3 that indicates elimination, and there's an original mass at time 0. And then there's a separate equation. The first equation we'll call the state equation, a separate equation for the output, the concentration, as a function of mass, and P4 is often called volume of distribution. We choose neutral names for P1 until P11, I believe. Now, this simple state equation and output equation can be generalized, and because in the case of the Jeffrey example, this first set of equations was linear and time invariant and single input, single output. And in the generalization, I'll be using u of t for an input variable, x of t for a state variable, and y of t for an output variable, and they can be vectors. And I'll use notations for parameters, lowercase a, b, c, d, or uppercase a, b, c, d, or functions, f and g. So the Jeffrey example is generalized to this form. The state variable, in their case, mass, is a function of mass and of input. The output can be a function of both. In case of the Jeffrey example, the d was equal to 0. So this is still linear time invariant in single input, single output. Keep in mind that what I mean by that is that the input u of t and the output y of t are scalars, variables. X can be either a scalar or a vector, and you've seen more complex systems, I believe, in section 4.1. One form of generalization is that we can make both inputs and outputs vectors. And We can have multiple drug infusions, we can have multiple drug effects, and then we get a formulation that looks very much like the previous one, except for that now A, B, C, D have become uppercase A, B, C, D, meaning that they're matrices. You may have to brush up a little bit on your mathematics. I remember this was a problem in the first year for the people who did regulation and integration with me, and because my son, who was a psychologist, understood all of this, I thought, well, this has to work for you too. And it turned out that that was a challenge for some people. If I want to represent a time variant system, then these matrices change over time. It's still linear, but now the system can become more or less responsive over time. And then the final update is when we go to nonlinear systems, and then I have to replace these functions, these linear functions, by very general functions f and g of t, but still functions of the state variable, the input, and possibly time. So very similar formulations, but progressively more and more powerful in terms of what they can represent. I developed this further, I believe, in my chapter 1 already. Conceptual models. So we this time I'm the conceptual model of the circulation. I'm no longer presenting the simplified version as we did before. And here you can see, for example, that the atria are included, and there's a bit more detail in the systemic circulation. So this is a conceptual model of the circulation. To transform that into a mathematical model, we need to use a table that's in chapter 4 of my book with component description. So each one of these components, and there's only 5 or 6 different components in here, has a description. And it's not I'm going to shift this table, so there's although I'm standing in front of a few of these definitions, this is a lot of information, but I'll show you that you've seen most of this in the past. But let's look at the resistor, for example, and the symbol is there, and the resistor is essentially a relationship between pressure across the resistor and the flow. And a way to represent that relationship is in a graph. Pressure difference at the bottom and flow as a dependent variable, or it can be the other way around. And then you can give a mathematical description, and in this case, this is Ohm's law, or in a way it's a form of Poisson's law for a resistance. And of course, for the same symbol, we can accommodate nonlinear relationships, and then we get a bit more mathematical description. So the table is made for linear components. At least as far as resistance is concerned. I will not go over each one of these, but you do need to know what's behind these components before you can start using them. But once you do, that's where the cookbook approach comes from. You have the diagram, you look up the mathematical description, and then you connect those mathematical descriptions. And how we do the connection, I'll explain in just a few minutes. If we look at the compliance here, you do see a nonlinearity there. When the volume in a vein or an artery goes up, initially not much happens, but then, like for a balloon, pressure starts to build up. So that's what that angle represents, and this parameter UV is not ultraviolet, it's unstressed volume, and then only then you can start to see the effect of the compliance. Now, I really don't need to treat all of these elements because you've seen most of them. And so if I shift this over a bit, this piece of the table, I can put electrical analogs right next to it. And if you, for example, if you look at the resistor, that's identical with the exception of the names of the variables. And you have to be a bit careful because sometimes the electrical engineering components have a little bit different behavior. Something like an unstressed volume or a charge without voltage doesn't really occur in electrical engineering. And for me, this is one more reason to work with these direct representations, because they're a bit closer to our, for example, hydraulic reality than are the electrical engineering components. But these tables, these admittedly somewhat complex tables, are not totally new to you. So use your understanding and knowledge of electrical symbols if you have any. Otherwise, you'll have to study a bit on these different components for fluid systems. There's a systematic approach to translating circuits into mathematics, and that systematic approach is via the Kirchhoff laws, the current and voltage laws. Now, some of you may know how to do that, and the more electrically oriented people may know how to do that. But I know how to do it, but I hardly use it. So I use a bit of a shortcut and my own algorithm to solve these problems. So my recommendation is that certainly for the class, you would do the same, unless you really, really need the Kirchhoff, the systematic Kirchhoff-based approach. I usually start by volume. And that's almost compartment volume or compliance volume is almost always a state variable. Then I compute the different pressures as a function of volume. Based on the pressures, we can compute flow over resistances. And sometimes you have parallel resistances, so it then becomes a bit more complicated. But once we have flow, then we can compute a volume update or a change of volume over time, as we've seen also in a very simple hydraulic example in the beginning. So, and once we've done that, we can use this equation to compute a prediction of volume. I'll get to discrete time towards the end in the exercise, and we're back to volume. So the first purpose here is to derive our equations, and then in the second stage, once you have these equations, you can write them in discrete time and use them in an algorithm. But so this is my recommended shortcut for deriving semi-systematically the equations once you have a circuit diagram. Now, I'm not going to do that for the whole cardiovascular system here. Because of the order of the system, we end up having 33, 34 equations. But you can find them in my book. You do need the full version there. Well, as I said, Hans has 5 paper copies, and there's 2 paper copies in the TechMed Center library. Not everybody probably needs to look at them, but certainly the people that are going to work on the cardiovascular system may do well to look at those equations. So you have access to them, but unfortunately not easily. I can only make 2 chapters available without getting arrested. That concludes my lecture on mathematical modeling of the cardiovascular system. So do a bit of additional background reading so that to become familiar with the process, but you have an outline. A few comments and highlights. I have talked a bit about hierarchy and modularity. But I wanted to mention those 2 concepts explicitly. So hierarchy is, when we talk about systems and subsystems, a very important notion in systems theory, and by now you've seen examples of hierarchy, and the overall block diagram, then a more detailed block diagram, then the circuit diagrams. That's all an example of hierarchy. What allows us that allows us to apply modularity. I can take out one component, for example, a cardiovascular model, and replace it by another one. And my system, if it's well structured, my system representation, if it's a model, will still work. I will come back a bit more to numerical integration in the example, but be aware of the fact that for many tools that's transparent, but that brings danger with it. I usually use fairly simple numerical integration methods, even the Euler integration method, and then you just have to select your your integration step carefully. If you make very small jumps from the present to a little bit into the future, then your computation may last very long, or your simulation may last very long, and for example not be real time, but it will be very accurate. So there's a balance there between accuracy and having an efficient simulation. Two central concepts in this whole process are code verification and model validation. So code verification is often skipped, but if there's a mistake in your code and it's impossible to write code without mistakes, your conclusions may not be valid. And so if you work as a group, that makes code verification a bit easier. Then the group needs to work with their supervisors, because reviewers of papers are not going to verify code. So put in place a procedure for code verification, and if you can, build in some tests of known responses and see if they all make sense. And then that only verifies if your software functions. That doesn't say anything about if you have a good or a poor or a very bad model. That's what you do with model validation, and that's where you do comparison to simulation results. I'm not going to talk about that in this series of lectures, but it will be part of your biological control systems tasks. Very important concepts: code verification and model validation. So a summary of these 5 introductory lectures, and then, as I said, there will be one more lecture with introducing an exercise. 3 concepts: central concepts, systems, models, and simulators. Make sure that you can distinguish those, as a system is an ensemble, a model is a representation, abstract representation, and a simulator is again a concrete device, and very complementary concepts, especially when you use them in conjunction, and a procedure. So a stepwise procedure of model requirements, and then separating the modeling part into conceptual and mathematical models. We talked about that a lot in this last 2 lectures. And then a few more steps, many of which you will execute as part of the class: software implementation and code verification, simulation results, and model validation, and then hopefully use of your model in your case to explain a result. It's, as far as I'm concerned, so I've been working with this for a little over 30 years, and the main impact of the models and simulators I've designed is that we, not on my own, but with teams, of course, always. But the main impact is that we no longer use animals or real patients for training of medical students or anesthesiologists, intensivists, etc. And by now, I've worked on about 6 full-body simulators and 3 screen-based simulators. By now, these simulators have been sold for over $1 billion Canadian dollars, which means that they're getting used to train people. It also means that a lot of people got interesting, meaningful jobs, and I hope that this biological control systems class will be the start of a career in modeling and simulation, at least for some of you, and even for those who don't, they will learn some very important and very powerful tools for research. There's still a lot of work to be done in modeling and simulation. I'll talk to you in a bit for the final lecture/exercise, and then we'll go from there. Bye-bye.